In the year 12 CE, during the height of the Roman Empire, a child was born into a dynasty of power, military prestige, and divine ancestry. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. He was the son of the revered General Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, granddaughter of Augustus himself. But the world would not remember him as Gaius. They would remember him by a nickname, Caligula, meaning little boots, a term of endearment given by Roman soldiers when the young boy accompanied his father on campaigns in Germania. Dressed in a miniature legionnaire's uniform, he was adored by the army. Caligula's early childhood was marked by immense promise but also devastating loss. In 19 CE, his father Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances while stationed in the east. Some suspected foul play, possibly poison, perhaps even ordered by Emperor Tiberius, who may have feared Germanicus's popularity. The truth remains uncertain. In the years that followed, tragedy closed in on his family. His mother clashed with Tiberius, leading to her exile and eventual death. His two elder brothers were also arrested and likely starved to death in imperial custody. By the age of 17, Caligula had lost nearly everyone in his immediate family. Despite the bloodshed, Caligula survived. Tiberius brought him to live on the island of Capri, a place known for seclusion and secrecy. There he was surrounded by cruelty, decadence, and absolute power. Ancient historian Suetonius claimed the island was filled with acts of corruption and paranoia. Caligula learned to hide his thoughts. He was patient. He adapted. Later, he would allegedly say, "I have kept my hatred buried until the right time." In 37 CE, Emperor Tiberius died, possibly smothered by the Praetorian prefect Macro, and Caligula, at just 24 years old, was declared princeps, or first citizen, of Rome. At first, the people rejoiced. He was seen as the heir of Germanicus, a symbol of hope after the paranoia of Tiberius's reign. He abolished unpopular taxes. He recalled political exiles. He organized lavish games and celebrations. For the first 6 months, he ruled competently, with the support of the Senate and the people. Then everything changed. In late 37 CE, Caligula suffered a mysterious and life-threatening illness. Some speculate it was epilepsy, others encephalitis, or possibly poisoning. He recovered, but the man who emerged from the sickbed was not the same. His personality shifted dramatically. He became suspicious, erratic, and violent. He declared himself a living god and demanded divine honors. He ordered the construction of temples in his name, had his image installed in religious sites, and reportedly demanded to be worshipped as Jupiter reborn. He forced senators to grovel before him. He would have nobles whipped or humiliated publicly for amusement. Once, he invited several senators to dinner, then mocked them as they were served scraps while he dined alone. His cruelty knew no boundaries. He is said to have had entire families executed based on rumors. He confiscated wealth to fund his building projects and entertainment. His reign was marked by torture, surveillance, and state terror. And yet, the bizarre excesses are what most define his legend. He built floating palaces across the Bay of Naples, using ships fitted with marble floors, gardens, and bathhouses. He had entire sections of cities rebuilt on whims, only to have them torn down again. He reportedly declared war on the sea god Neptune, instructing Roman soldiers to attack the waves and collect seashells as spoils of victory. One of the most infamous stories involves his favorite horse, Incitatus. Caligula gave the horse a marble stable, purple blankets, and even a house with servants. According to Suetonius, he intended to make the horse a consul. Whether this was literal or a calculated insult to the Roman Senate remains debated, but the message was clear. Caligula held Rome's institutions in contempt. He also had political rivals executed, including his own brother-in-law. At one point, he forced the governor of Gaul to hold gladiator games at his own expense. Caligula would arrive late, order changes in the program, and leave early, entirely unconcerned with protocol. He expanded the imperial cult, not just through Rome, but across the empire. In Alexandria, tensions exploded when he tried to install his statue in the Jewish temple, an act that nearly caused a revolt. Only the intervention of King Herod Agrippa and Caligula's eventual assassination prevented bloodshed. By 40 CE, the mood in Rome had shifted. The Senate feared him. The Praetorian Guard grew restless. Caligula's erratic behavior, combined with the financial strain of his rule, created dangerous enemies. On January 24, 41 CE, while walking through a palace corridor after attending the theatre, Caligula was approached by a group of guards. They drew their swords and stabbed him repeatedly. He collapsed in shock, still gasping for breath. Ancient accounts state he was stabbed more than 30 times. His wife and infant daughter were also murdered to prevent any claim to succession. Caligula had ruled for just under 4 years. In that time, he left no legislation, no military victories, no reforms, only chaos, cruelty, and a city traumatized. His name became synonymous with tyranny, excess, and madness. Historians like Cassius Dio and Suetonius debated whether he was mentally ill or simply corrupted by absolute power. Modern scholars have considered medical explanations, epilepsy, hypothyroidism, or even lead poisoning from the empire's pipes and cosmetics, but no definitive diagnosis can be made. What remains undisputed is his impact. Caligula exposed the weaknesses of imperial rule, how quickly a single ruler could upend law, tradition, and stability. His brief reign left a legacy of caution, forcing future emperors to be more careful in masking their authority. He was not Rome's last tyrant, but he was its most flamboyant. Nero, the emperor who played with fire. In the winter of 37 CE, on the 15th of December, a child was born into the powerful Julio-Claudian dynasty. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, but the world would remember him by another name, Nero. He would become the last emperor of his bloodline, and one of the most infamous in Roman history. Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, was no ordinary Roman matron. She was the sister of Caligula, granddaughter of Mark Antony and great-granddaughter of Augustus. Ruthless and ambitious, she was determined that her son would one day rule Rome. When Nero was just 2, his father died. Agrippina soon found herself exiled by Emperor Caligula for alleged involvement in a plot against him. But after Caligula's assassination, her fortunes changed. She returned to court and married her uncle, Emperor Claudius. In a move that shocked Roman society, Claudius adopted Nero and named him heir over his own biological son, Britannicus. Nero's ascent was swift and well orchestrated. At age 16, he was married to Claudius's daughter, Octavia. A year later, Claudius was dead, many believed poisoned by Agrippina. The food, according to the historian Tacitus, was laced with poison mushrooms. Whether true or not, Nero now wore the purple. The teenage emperor was crowned in 54 CE. In the beginning, he did not rule alone. His mother dominated court politics. His tutor was the Stoic philosopher Seneca, and his chief military advisor, Burrus, led the Praetorian Guard. Together they governed wisely. Nero abolished capital punishment, provided grain to the poor, and even banned bloodshed in public spectacles for a time. The Senate praised his rule. The people celebrated his generosity. But beneath the surface, the boy emperor was changing. Nero longed for fame, not as a general or a politician, but as a performer. He played the lyre, he recited poetry, and he fantasized about appearing on stage, something no emperor had ever done. To the Roman aristocracy, this was shameful. To Nero, it was destiny. His mother grew possessive. She expected to rule through him, but Nero grew tired of her influence. He removed her from palace affairs, then from the court. Soon, she became a threat. In 59 CE, he arranged her assassination. First, a collapsing boat was designed to drown her, but she swam to shore. Then came the second attempt. That night, assassins entered her villa and stabbed her to death. When the news reached Nero, he reportedly could not eat or sleep. But days later, he celebrated games in her honor, an act that scandalized even his supporters. Freed from her influence, Nero descended further into indulgence. He surrounded himself with flatterers, artists, and sycophants. He divorced Octavia, accusing her of infertility, and later executed her under false charges of adultery. He married Poppaea Sabina, who had once been the wife of his friend Otho. She was beautiful, ambitious, and entirely devoted to Nero. But not even she was safe. In a fit of rage during her pregnancy, Nero kicked her in the abdomen. She died of her injuries. The unborn child, a daughter, also perished. Nero's taste for extravagance grew. He ordered the construction of palaces filled with gold leaf, rotating dining rooms and ceilings that rained rose petals. He entered music and poetry competitions across the empire. In one infamous case, he competed in Greece for months. No judge dared to declare him anything but the victor. Then came the fire. In July 64 CE, a blaze broke out in Rome near the Circus Maximus. It spread rapidly. For 6 days the city burned. 10 of 14 districts were destroyed. Nero was away in Antium when the fire began. But rumors spread that he had ordered it. Some claimed he sang of the fall of Troy as flames consumed the city. Tacitus, writing decades later, said Nero opened his own gardens to the homeless and arranged food supplies. Still, suspicion persisted. To shift blame, he accused the Christians, a small and unpopular sect. What followed was Rome's first imperial persecution of Christians. Many were burned alive, crucified, or mauled by wild beasts, while the emperor watched. After the fire, Nero rebuilt Rome in his own image. He began work on the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It was not a palace, it was an empire within the city. Lakes, vineyards, grand halls, and a colossal statue of himself as Sol, the sun god. This extravagance came at a price. He raised taxes, he confiscated properties. When the Senate protested, he silenced them with executions. Then in 65 CE, a major conspiracy was uncovered. The Pisonian conspiracy, named for the senator Gaius Calpurnius Piso, aimed to assassinate Nero and restore senatorial power. The plot was foiled. Dozens were executed. Seneca, his former tutor, was ordered to take his own life. He did so by opening his veins, an image immortalized in Roman art. The purges continued. Even his closest allies were no longer safe. Nero, increasingly isolated and delusional, continued to perform across the empire. He even traveled to Greece, where he made thousands of appearances. The Senate, meanwhile, grew restless. In 68 CE, rebellion erupted. Governors in Gaul and Hispania declared allegiance to the Senate. The Praetorian Guard abandoned Nero. The Senate condemned him as a public enemy and ordered his arrest. Nero fled to the villa of a freedman, hiding as soldiers closed in. When he learned of his impending execution, he cried, "What an artist dies in me!" With trembling hands, he drove a dagger into his throat, assisted by a servant. He was 30 years old. Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Rome descended into chaos. The following year, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, brought civil war and collapse. Nero left no heir, No military legacy, no peace, only fire, fear, and a reputation that has endured for 2,000 years. Leopold II, the Butcher of the Congo. On a chilly April morning in 1835, in the grand royal palace of Brussels, a prince was born who would one day become one of the most notorious figures in modern history. His name was Leopold, the second king of the Belgians, but the world would remember him not as a monarch, but as a tyrant, a man whose thirst for power and profit would lead to the deaths of millions. Leopold II came to the throne in 1865, inheriting a small but prosperous constitutional monarchy. Belgium had no empire, no colonies, no global power, but Leopold had a dream, one that would cast a long shadow over the heart of Africa. He believed greatness lay not in ruling Belgium, but in ruling beyond Belgium. If other European powers could carve up the world, why not him? But there was a problem. The Belgian government refused to fund a colonial venture, so Leopold created one himself. In 1876, he formed the International African Association, a so-called humanitarian organization. Its stated goal was to bring civilization, Christianity, and commerce to the people of Central Africa. But behind the mask of charity, a private empire was being built. To gain control of territory, Leopold hired explorers like Henry Morton Stanley, the man famed for finding Dr. Livingstone. Stanley, under Leopold's orders, used trickery, intimidation, and outright force to extract treaties from hundreds of African leaders, documents they could not read, surrendering lands they did not understand. In 1885, at the Berlin Conference, Leopold secured international recognition for the Congo Free State. But it was not a Belgian colony, it was something far more dangerous. The Congo Free State belonged to Leopold personally, a territory 80 times larger than Belgium, ruled by one man with no oversight, not as a king, but as a corporate despot. What followed was one of the most brutal colonial regimes in recorded history. The Congo was rich in ivory and rubber. As the world's demand for rubber exploded, driven by bicycles, automobiles, and machinery, Leopold saw an opportunity for unimaginable profit. But instead of trade, he turned to terror. Villages were forced to meet rubber quotas. Those who failed suffered mutilation, torture, or death. The force publique, Leopold's private army, enforced his rule with fire and rope. They took women hostage. They burned entire communities. And when soldiers used bullets, they were ordered to return with the severed right hand of each person killed, to prove no ammunition had been wasted. The scale of the horror defies belief. Modern estimates suggest 10 million Congolese died under Leopold's rule through murder, starvation, disease, and despair. That was half the population. Leopold never set foot in the Congo. He ruled it from afar through maps, ledgers, and telegrams. And while the forests ran red, he built grand monuments in Brussels, using Congolese wealth to fund opera houses, parks, and royal estates. To the Belgian public, Leopold was a benevolent king. To the world, he was a philanthropist. He donated to museums, funded public works, and posed as a savior of Africa. But behind the veil, the truth was beginning to slip out. It started with a whistleblower, George Washington Williams, an African-American journalist who visited the Congo in 1890. He called it a human slaughterhouse. Missionaries followed, then diplomats, and finally activists. Chief among them was E.D. Morel, a shipping clerk who noticed something strange. Rubber and ivory flowed into Belgium, but weapons and chains flowed out. Morel began to investigate. With the help of Irish diplomat Roger Casement, he exposed the systematic atrocities. Photographs emerged images of children missing limbs, of grieving families, of mass graves. The world recoiled in horror. Writers like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle denounced Leopold. In 1904, the British Parliament debated the Congo question. Leopold responded with outrage, calling the accusations lies and attacking his critics, but the pressure mounted. In 1908, the Belgian Parliament, under intense international scrutiny, annexed the Congo Free State, ending Leopold's personal reign. It became a colony of Belgium. But for many, the damage was irreversible. Leopold died the following year, in 1909. As his funeral procession passed through Brussels, crowds turned their backs. Some cheered, others hissed. The king who once claimed to be a father of his people was remembered not for greatness, but for genocide. Even on his deathbed, Leopold never expressed remorse. In fact, he ordered that all records from the Congo Free State be destroyed, attempting to erase the evidence of his crimes. But not all the evidence burned. Today, Leopold II is remembered as a cautionary tale of what happens when unchecked ambition meets absolute power, of how human lives can be reduced to ledgers, of how a king, in pursuit of rubber and ivory, became the architect of one of the deadliest regimes in modern history. He ruled not with armies or ideas, but with greed, and when his reign ended, the Congo was not liberated, it was broken. Enver Hoxha, the man who locked a nation. In the small Albanian town of Gjirokastra, nestled in the mountains near the Greek border, a boy was born on a cold October day in 1908. His name was Enver Hoxha. He would grow into a man who promised progress and unity, but delivered isolation, paranoia, and absolute control. Hoxha's path to power was not unlike others in the 20th century. He studied abroad in France and Belgium, absorbing Marxist literature. He worked briefly at the Albanian consulate in Brussels. But it was in the shadow of fascism and war that Hoxha found his moment. During World War II, Albania became a battleground, first occupied by fascist Italy, then Nazi Germany. Out of the chaos rose resistance movements, among them the Communist Party of Albania, founded in 1941. Hoxha, a relatively unknown figure at the time, became its first Secretary-General. He was charismatic, uncompromising, and utterly devoted to the ideology of Stalin. By the end of the war, the Communists had seized power. In 1946, Albania was declared a People's Republic. Hoxha became Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Defense, and eventually President of the Presidium. In reality, Enver Hoxha was Albania. Every decision, every law, every sentence passed in court flowed from him. The early years were marked by dramatic reforms. Feudal landholdings were abolished, industry was nationalized, religion was suppressed. Hoxha wanted to reshape society from the ground up. But this was no gentle revolution. Landlords, clergy, intellectuals, anyone suspected of disloyalty, were arrested, exiled, or executed. By the 1950s, Albania had become a one-party state. Surveillance was total. Speaking against the government could mean torture or death. Thousands were imprisoned in labor camps. Some were forced to work in mines deep beneath the mountains. Others died building roads to nowhere. There were no trials in any meaningful sense, just orders. And those orders came from Hoxha. For a time, Albania was allied with the Soviet Union. Stalin's death in 1953 shook the world, but Hoxha did not mourn quietly. He condemned the new leadership in Moscow, especially Nikita Khrushchev, for revisionism. To Hoxha, de-Stalinization was heresy. In 1961, he broke ties with the USSR. Albania turned instead to Maoist China, the only remaining communist state he trusted. But when China too began opening to the West, Hoxha denounced them as traitors. By 1978, Albania stood completely alone. No allies, no trade, no diplomacy. It became the most isolated country in Europe. Borders were sealed, foreigners were banned, and the state watched its citizens more closely than ever. Hoxha built a society of fear. Citizens were taught to report on neighbors and even family. Children informed on their parents. Entire families could be declared enemies of the people and deported to internal exile. The Sigurimi, the Albanian secret police, was one of the most ruthless in the communist world. It employed psychological torture, solitary confinement, sleep deprivation. By the 1980s, nearly 1 in every 3 Albanians was estimated to be involved in the surveillance system, either as victims, informants, or both. And then came the bunkers. Terrified of a foreign invasion that would never come, Hoxha ordered the construction of hundreds of thousands of concrete bunkers, small domed structures scattered across beaches, farmlands, and mountain slopes. Some estimates suggest over 170,000 were built. Most were never used, but the resources they consumed drained the country. Meanwhile, food shortages deepened, basic goods disappeared, electricity was intermittent, and yet official propaganda continued to portray Albania as a model state, self-reliant, pure, and incorruptible. Religion, too, was crushed. In 1967, Hoxha declared Albania the first atheist state in the world. Churches and mosques were closed, clergy were imprisoned or forced to renounce their faith. Crosses and crescents were torn down. Even owning a Bible or Quran could lead to arrest. He replaced religious belief with a cult of personality. His image was everywhere, on posters, in textbooks, on coins. Children sang songs in his honor. His writings were mandatory reading. To question Hoxha was to question Albania. Yet behind the scenes, the leader's health was failing. He suffered from diabetes, heart disease, and increasing isolation. Only a handful of trusted officials were allowed near him. One of them was Mehmet Shehu, his longtime ally and second-in-command. In 1981, Shehu was found dead in his home, shot in the head. The official report said suicide. Hoxha later claimed Shehu had been a traitor all along. His entire family was arrested. His name was erased from public life. It was a warning. In 1985, Enver Hoxha died of cardiac arrest at the age of 76. He had ruled Albania for 40 years, longer than Stalin, longer than Mao. At his funeral, a nation wept, some out of fear, others out of habit. But behind the mourning, the silence was breaking. 4 years later, communism began to collapse across Eastern Europe. Albania held on longer than most. But by 1992, the regime fell. The archives were opened, the prisons emptied, and the statues of Hoxha were toppled. He left behind a shattered country. One of the poorest in Europe, cut off from the world, haunted by trauma, fear, and silence. Even today, the scars remain. Bunkers still dot the countryside, silent monuments to a reign built on fear. A society once closed tighter than any iron curtain still struggles with its past. Enver Hoxha promised to build a perfect state. What he built was a prison, one without bars, but no less confining. Francisco Franco, the dictator who silenced a nation. In the rugged hills of Galicia, northern Spain, a boy was born in December of 1892. His name was Francisco Franco. He would rise from a quiet military family to become the face of authoritarian rule in Spain, a man whose iron grip would freeze an entire nation for nearly 4 decades. Franco's path to power began early. At just 14, he entered the infantry academy in Toledo. By 17, he was deployed to Spanish Morocco, where Spain was fighting a brutal colonial war. Franco quickly gained a reputation for discipline, loyalty, and extreme conservatism. He was wounded, decorated, and promoted faster than most of his peers. By age 33, he became the youngest general in Europe. He was not charismatic, he rarely raised his voice, but he was methodical and utterly devoted to order. In 1931, Spain underwent a seismic shift. The monarchy was replaced by the Second Spanish Republic, a fragile democracy riddled with tension. Leftist reforms angered the military, the church, and the aristocracy. The far right and far left clashed violently. By 1936, Spain was on the edge of collapse. Then came the trigger. In July 1936, a group of generals staged a coup. It failed to seize power outright, but it ignited a civil war. Spain was divided. On one side, Republicans, socialists, anarchists, and communists. On the other, monarchists, conservatives, and fascists, backed by large parts of the army. Among the rebels was Franco. Thanks to his military experience and ruthless efficiency, Franco quickly rose to supreme command of the nationalist forces. He coordinated with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, both eager to test their weapons and doctrines. Hitler sent the Condor Legion, aircraft that would destroy entire cities, most famously Guernica, where hundreds of civilians were killed in a single bombing. It was one of the first modern air raids on a civilian population. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union sent aid to the Republicans. International volunteers arrived on both sides, but Franco's forces, better organized and supported, gained ground steadily. In 1939, Madrid fell. The Republicans surrendered. The civil war had killed over 500,000 people, and Franco, now El Caudillo, the leader, took full control of Spain. He abolished the Republic. Political parties were banned. Trade unions dismantled. Censorship was total. Spain became a dictatorship, but Franco was not a revolutionary. He did not seek mass mobilization like Hitler or Mussolini. His regime was cold, bureaucratic, and deeply traditional. The Catholic Church regained immense power. Women were pushed back into domestic roles. Education was purged of liberal and secular ideas. Franco's Spain was built on fear. Tens of thousands of political opponents were imprisoned or executed. Many were tried by military tribunals, others simply disappeared. The regime maintained detailed surveillance records, dossiers on citizens' behavior, beliefs, even religious practice. One of the most chilling aspects was the treatment of children. Republican mothers were labeled unfit. Their children were taken, adopted by loyalist families or placed in religious institutions. For decades, the government denied this policy. Only in the 21st century did documents confirm that over 30,000 children were likely stolen. Franco remained neutral during World War II, but his sympathies were clear. He sent a division, the Blue Division, to fight alongside Nazi troops on the Eastern Front. At home, Jews and political refugees were sometimes protected, but also monitored and pressured to leave. Franco's regime walked a tightrope, aligned with fascist ideology, yet eager to avoid total ruin. When Hitler and Mussolini fell, Franco remained. He survived by shifting. He portrayed himself as a bulwark against communism, and during the Cold War, that was enough. By the 1950s, the United States saw Franco as a strategic ally. Military bases were built, aid flowed in, Spain was allowed into the United Nations. Western democracies turned a blind eye to dictatorship for the sake of containment. Economic reforms followed. By the 1960s, Spain began to modernize. Tourism grew, industries expanded, but political repression continued. Strikes were illegal, dissent was crushed, and Catalan and Basque culture were outlawed, languages banned from schools, books, and television. As Franco aged, he refused to let go. Even as other dictators were deposed, he tightened his grip. In 1969, he named his own successor, Prince Juan Carlos, restoring the monarchy under his control. Spain's future, once uncertain, now seemed permanently frozen, but nothing lasts forever. On November 20th, 1975, Franco died at the age of 82. He had ruled Spain for 36 years. What followed was unexpected. Juan Carlos, rather than continue the dictatorship, initiated democratic reforms. Censorship was lifted, political prisoners released, parties legalized. Spain transitioned to democracy. But the wounds remained. Tens of thousands of graves, mass graves from the Civil War, and Franco's purges still dot the countryside. The Valley of the Fallen, a colossal monument Franco built for his side of the war, became a symbol of division. In 2019, his remains were exhumed and moved, sparking fierce debate over memory, justice, and truth. Francisco Franco left behind a legacy of silence. He suppressed opposition, he reshaped a nation in his image, and for nearly 4 decades he ensured that Spain's past would remain hidden. But history does not forget. It waits beneath stones, in archives, and in voices long silenced.